Well, everyone, the OnePlus 8 was one of those phones that I truly do believe was one of OnePlus's last significant massive phones that they released. It was a beautiful device, and I honestly do think coming from the OnePlus 7, it was a worthwhile upgrade, and even coming from the OnePlus 7 Pro, this was a pretty good phone too. Now, for those of you who don't remember, 2019, OnePlus just went on a bender. They released so many great phones that year. Even the OnePlus 7T and 7T Pro were pretty good phones. With the OnePlus 8 and 2020 in general, this was kind of the tipping point for OnePlus. They began to start kind of going away from what they usually did. For example, the OnePlus 8 and OnePlus 8 Pro, beautiful phones, but typically towards the end of the year, they will release like a successor and like a little bit of a refresh. And we did kind of get one with the OnePlus 8T, but we didn't get a OnePlus 8T Pro or anything like that. With the OnePlus 8, this was, I think, the beginning to the end of OnePlus in a way. Nowadays, I mean, OnePlus 10 came out and I don't even think so that many people talked about it, which is interesting. So it's very weird to see how OnePlus was not too long ago and see where they are now. It's actually very, very interesting to me. Now, if you want to buy this phone or some other phones I'd recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, on the front of the OnePlus 8, we have a beautiful 6.55-inch fluid AMOLED display. It's a 90Hz panel, and even though it's 1080p, it really isn't even that bad. And funny enough, when you consider all of the phones that have came out since then, including a lot of Samsung phones, we're still getting 1080p panels on them. So it's not even really that big of a deal. You look at the Galaxy S22 and the S22 Plus that just came out, those phones also have 1080p panels. So it's really not that big of a deal, and I'm not even freaking out about it too much, to be honest. I think at that point it was a little weird, but I've certainly gotten used to it, and it's not really that big of a deal to me. It's a hole punch display, which I actually prefer over that pop-up camera that the OnePlus 7 Pro had. On the bottom we have that USB Type-C port, which I think is cool. You know, I love having USB Type-C on these phones. And on the back, we have a frosted glass back, which still looks and feels extremely premium. Like I mentioned, you know, OnePlus made some really good phones in terms of hardware, and this was definitely one of them for sure. Now, we don't have any IP certification on this phone, which is kind of a bummer. And we don't have any wireless charging. Now, wireless charging, it's not a big deal to me, but I would love to have IP certification. You know, having a very durable phone that's certified like that is really important to me, and this phone didn't have it, but again, it may not affect too many people. Now, that really pretty much covers it up on the outside. There really isn't much else to it. Now, we do have that camera setup on this thing as well. On the back, we had kind of like a triple camera setup. We had a 48 megapixel wide angle lens, 16 megapixel ultra wide sensor, then a 2 megapixel macro lens, which honestly, it's not really that crazy big of a deal. On the front, we have a 16 megapixel camera. Now, here was the thing about this specific phone. We didn't have the ability of shooting 4K at 60 on the front. We only had 1080p at 30, which was kind of a big disadvantage. By this point, pretty much all of the phones at the marketplace, I mean, including the Galaxy S20s, the iPhone 11s at the time, they all had the capability of shooting 4K on the front. And for this phone to not have it was very, very strange to me. We did have the ability of shooting 4K at 60 on the back, which I like. You know, I love having that capability too, but it was very strange that we didn't have that, you know, in the first place. Now, what I can tell you about this camera is that it's really not a bad camera by any means, but when compared to a lot of the phones that we have nowadays, I mean, it's really not that great of a camera. I mean, it's like good enough for the most part, but when you have phones like the Samsung Galaxy S22s, even the Galaxy S20 of this year that came out in 2020, and especially the Samsung Galaxy S21 that came out the year after, and the iPhone 12s that came out the same year, those phones pretty much had better cameras than this one. So when you're looking at them and you're trying to figure out which camera is the better one or whatever, I mean, the OnePlus 8's camera really didn't hold up that well this year. Even the OnePlus 8 Pro's camera honestly wasn't that great either. I do prefer iPhone cameras and Samsung cameras over this one, but I don't think the OnePlus had a bad camera. You know, I wouldn't necessarily say this was a horrible camera or anything like that, but you were definitely getting a much better camera setup on pretty much all the other phones in the marketplace. Including that, I mean, I do want to say, if you're using apps like Snapchat and Instagram and all those applications I usually test, you're really not going to be getting that crazy great of an experience on this thing either. So that's another kind of slight thing to remember. I hate, you know, bringing up the Snapchat and stuff all the time, but those are the applications I use the most. And I do think with something like the OnePlus 8 nowadays, again, it is what it is. I don't think it's a horrible camera anymore, but it wasn't the best when it came out, and I don't think it's really gotten that much better since then. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Now in terms of the software, this is kind of like the hit or miss thing about this specific phone. So when it first came out, it was on, Oxygen OS, one of my favorite versions of software. It's now getting this like color OS thing from Apple or whatever. I'm not really too sure what to make of it. I never got a chance to install it on my OnePlus 8, so I'm not really even going to get it. So I'm not going to be able to talk about that, but I did love Oxygen OS. I loved Oxygen OS a lot. It was one of my favorite versions of Android. Now I'm back to stock Android saying that one's my favorite. But I will say with something like the OnePlus 8, luckily for us, we did have stock Android on it. And luckily for us, there's still, I think, a custom ROM community behind this phone too. And that's a good thing about a lot of OnePlus phones. You have the ability of actually just installing a custom ROM if you want to. And that's a really cool thing. There's not a lot of phones out there that you have the ability of rooting and custom ROMing. And this is kind of still one of those phones, which I think is kind of a big deal. Now, I would still recommend if you want to, pick up one of the newer phones, especially a phone that's still supported. The OnePlus 8 is still supported, but you'd be better off picking up something like the Pixel this year or, an iPhone of this year. But I still think, But the other thing is it seems like OnePlus is getting really out of touch as well, and I would hate to recommend a phone that some of you may get and then may regret because of the software, so I'll just leave it at that. But, I would probably recommend buying like the Pixel 6 or something like that if you want a more software-like phone. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now hitting on the performance side of things, this specific phone had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 865 chipset inside of it, an Adreno 650 GPU, and 6 gigs of RAM on the base model, 8 gigs of RAM on the mid-tier model, and then 12 gigabytes of RAM on the top tier model. Now what I can tell you about the performance of this phone is that, I think it's still a pretty decent performing phone. It's definitely not bad, and I think it's way better off great than, bad. I mean, this is a really good performing phone still. Now, it's definitely not perfect. Like I mentioned, there may be some things here and there that probably rub me the wrong way. I think one of the biggest things about this phone, like I mentioned, is the newer software, but I never got a chance to install it. Just based off what I heard from everybody else, that's kind of what the consensus is. But I do think on stock Android, this thing was very, very good. And with 90 Hz refresh rate on top of it, even though it's still not at that 120 Hz, that is still like a really fair refresh rate for things to look a lot smoother than they actually may be on like a 60 Hz panel. So I will definitely tell you when it comes down to the whole entire performance of this phone, again, maybe it's not the best performing phone anymore, but I still think it's pretty decent. And you also have quite a bit of range on this phone as well. You can go and pick up like the base model with 6 gigabytes of RAM, but you can also go up to 12 gigabytes of RAM too in terms of RAM. So you have a lot of range there, and I would always recommend buying more RAM than not, but that's honestly one of my other favorite things about this phone too. And although this phone isn't a perfect performing phone anymore, I still think it's pretty decent. And I think if you need to use a phone on an everyday basis, this is not a bad option by any means. So in terms of performance, that covers it up there. Now in terms of battery life, this specific phone had a 4,300 milliamp battery, which is actually a pretty big size battery to have on a phone. It seems like OnePlus really focused in on the battery of this year, and I'm a fan of this battery life. It's a pretty decently big phone, so it has a pretty good battery life to suffice for it, and I'm a fan of the battery life on this phone too. I still think it's pretty good, and I definitely don't think it's a con by any means. So in terms of that covers it. And to be honest, I still think the OnePlus 8 is completely worth it in 2022. I think it's still a great phone, for so many different tasks out there. I don't think it's perfect, and I think a majority of you may know that. I mean, I think a majority of you may also know like it's not really like the best phone by any means right nowadays, but I still think it's pretty much worth it. If you want to go and pick it up, by all means go for it. I do think if you can go for something like the Galaxy S22, the iPhone 13, the Google Pixel 6 or Pixel 6 Pro, but if you're a diehard OnePlus fan, this is a great option, and I do think this is one of the last great OnePlus phones that they actually made. So in terms of that covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that means so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.